He had everything a man could dream of: money, honor, the kind of face that made people turn twice, and a story the whole town admired. That I wasn't supposed to notice more than that I wasn't supposed to feel the way I did when his eyes found mine that first night. But the truth. The second our hands touched, I knew I'd never be the same, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stay away. The town I lived in had a rhythm you could set your watch to. The same fishing boats came in every morning. The same gulls circled the pier, squawking over scraps. The same small talk filled the air at the diner. Nothing really changed here, and most days I told myself I liked it that way. It was safe. Predictable. But that night at the veterans event, the air felt different, almost restless, like the ocean before a storm. People had gathered in the community hall, warm light spilling onto the street, laughter and chatter rolling out with every opening of the door. I went because I knew I should, not because I expected anything. I wanted to shake a few hands, maybe make polite conversation, then slip out before anyone noticed. That plan ended the moment I saw him. Ethan stood near the center of the room, and it was impossible not to notice him. He had the kind of presence that made the rest of the crowd fade, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform jacket perfectly tailored, medals glinting under the soft lights. People orbited him, old men with firm handshakes, young kids staring up with wide-eyed admiration, women leaning in just a little too close when they spoke. He carried himself with quiet confidence, smiling easily but never forced. Everything about him told the same story. Here was a man who had seen the world, faced danger, and come out on top. But while everyone else saw the perfect soldier, I noticed something else. In those pauses between smiles, in the moments when no one was speaking to him, his gaze seemed to drift somewhere far away, as if part of him was still out there in a place the rest of us couldn't follow. I told myself to keep walking, to find a spot along the wall where I could blend into the background, but then he turned his head, and our eyes locked. It was just a second, maybe less, but it felt like it reached straight through my chest. I forced myself to look away, pretending to be absorbed in a display of old photographs, though my pulse had picked up in a way I couldn't ignore. The night moved on, and I kept finding excuses to be in his line of sight. Once, I caught him looking back, just for a moment, before someone else claimed his attention. I thought that was the end of it until I felt a shadow fall beside me. "Haven't seen you here before," he said, voice low, warm, and steady. I turned and found him standing close enough for me to catch the faint scent of his cologne, something clean with a hint of spice. My brain scrambled for something clever, but all I managed was, "I don't come to these much." He smiled, like that answer made perfect sense, and extended his hand. "Ethan." His grip was firm, steady, and for a second longer than necessary, he didn't let go. I told him my name, and it rolled off his tongue like he'd said it before. He asked a few questions, where I was from, what I did, and listened in a way that made it feel like the rest of the room didn't exist. We talked about nothing important, but I remember every word, every glance, as if they were burned into me. And then someone called his name from across the room, and he gave me a small, apologetic nod before stepping away. The crowd swallowed him up again, and I stood there trying to look unaffected, even though my hand still tingled where he'd touched it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I smiled when expected, shook hands when offered, but my attention kept drifting to where he stood. Once or twice our eyes met again, fleeting and electric. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading into things that weren't there. He had a perfect life, a perfect image, and I was just another stranger in a town that would soon forget my name. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted in that moment, something I didn't have words for yet. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of the ocean in the distance, I realized I was already thinking about the next time I might see him. I didn't want to admit it, but it was already too late. He had left his mark on me in the space of a few heartbeats, and I could feel it settling in, dangerous and undeniable. 3 days passed before I saw him again, though those days felt longer than they should have. I went about my routine, work in the mornings, errands in the afternoons, the quiet evenings I usually welcomed, but I couldn't shake the memory of his voice or the way his hand had felt in mine. Every time I walked down Main Street, I caught myself glancing into shop windows as if he might suddenly appear there, leaning casually against the counter with that easy smile. It was late in the morning when I pushed open the door to the coffee shop on the corner. The smell of roasted beans wrapped around me, the sound of the espresso machine hissed over soft music. I ordered my usual and found a seat by the window, not expecting anything more than a quiet hour to myself. And then I saw him. Ethan was standing at the counter, dressed casually in a navy hoodie and worn jeans, his posture relaxed but still carrying that same quiet strength. He was talking to the barista, a familiar warmth in his voice, like he'd been there before, like he belonged everywhere he went. When he turned and spotted me, there was no hesitation. His smile broke across his face in a way that made my stomach tighten, and he walked straight toward my table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, though he was already pulling out the chair across from me. I told him no, of course not, and tried to sound casual even though my pulse was quickening. He set his coffee down and leaned back, studying me for a moment before speaking. "You didn't tell me the other night that you were hiding out here." His tone was playful, but his eyes were sharp, as if he was trying to read me. I told him I wasn't hiding, just living, keeping my life simple. He nodded like he understood, and for a few minutes we talked about small things, the weather, the fishing boats, how quiet the town could be in the off-season. But then his questions began to shift. He asked about my family, my work, the places I'd been. When I asked about him, he answered, but not with the easy rehearsed lines you'd expect from someone in the public eye. He spoke in pieces, little glimpses of a much bigger story. A year spent overseas in a place he didn't name, the loss of a friend whose face still came to him at night, the restless feeling that followed him home. There was something disarming about the way he spoke. He wasn't performing, not with me. Every so often his gaze would drift to the window, his thumb tracing the rim of his coffee cup, and I could tell he was deciding how much to share. And every time his eyes came back to mine, it felt like he'd chosen me to carry that piece of him. When we finished our drinks, we stepped outside together, the cool wind off the water curling between us. I expected we'd part ways there, but he fell into step beside me. We walked the length of Main Street, stopping here and there as he greeted people who clearly adored him. He introduced me each time, simply and without hesitation, which struck me. It was the kind of thing that could mean nothing, or it could mean more than I wanted to admit. When we reached the edge of town where the boardwalk began, he slowed. "You ever walk down here at night?" he asked. I shook my head. "You should. The lights on the water make it feel like the world's holding its breath." I didn't know then if he was inviting me or simply making a suggestion, but the way he said it stayed with me. Before we parted, he reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out his phone. "Give me your number. For that community project we talked about," he said with a grin that told me he knew I'd see through the excuse. I gave it to him, and he saved it without asking for my last name, as if he already knew it. That night, my phone lit up just after 10. The message was simple, 3 words that made my chest tighten: "Still awake." I stared at it for longer than I should have before answering. We talked for over an hour, the conversation weaving between easy banter and quiet confessions. He told me about the things he missed from his childhood, the way he hated sleeping without the sound of the ocean nearby, the small rituals he used to calm his mind. I told him things I hadn't meant to share, my restlessness, my fear of becoming invisible in a place where nothing changed. Somewhere between the silences and the laughter, I realized this was no longer just a passing interest. Something was happening between us, slow but certain, and I didn't know where it would lead. All I knew was that when I finally put my phone down and lay in the dark, I could still feel him there with me, in the space between my thoughts, impossible to ignore. The days that followed seemed to bend around our conversations, as if the rest of my life was just the filler between the moments I heard from him. Sometimes it was a short text in the morning, a single line that somehow carried more warmth than most people could fit into a paragraph. Other times, it was a late-night call, his voice low and unhurried, as if the world beyond our words didn't matter. Each time, the space between us shrank a little more, though we never said out loud what was happening. I started to notice that he rarely spoke about the future. He talked about moments instead, fleeting ones, small details. He'd tell me about the smell of the desert after a storm, or the sound of rain hitting the metal roof of a barracks, or the way the air felt heavier in certain places overseas. I listened, drawn in not just by what he said but by what he didn't. There was always more beneath his words, a weight he didn't share with just anyone. One afternoon, he suggested we meet for a walk along the shore. The tide was low, and the wet sand reflected the pale sky like glass. He was dressed simply, worn boots, dark jeans, a sweater that looked like it had been through years of travel. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular, the sound of the waves filling the pauses. But somewhere between the laughter and the easy pace of our steps, his tone shifted. He told me about the nights after missions when sleep wouldn't come, how he'd lie awake thinking about people he barely knew but couldn't forget. He spoke about the pressure to be unshakable, to always be the one others could rely on, even when he felt like breaking. His words came slowly, as though each one had to be weighed before being set free. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, letting him empty the thoughts he kept locked behind that perfect image everyone else seemed to know. There were moments when he looked away, his eyes scanning the horizon like he was searching for something, and I wondered if it was a habit from his service or just a way to keep from being too exposed. At one point, he stopped walking. We stood facing the water, the breeze carrying the faint scent of salt and kelp. He turned to me, and for a second, it felt like the world went quiet. "Sometimes I think no one really sees me," he said, his voice almost lost to the wind. "They see the uniform. The medals. But not me." I wanted to tell him I saw more than that, that I'd seen it from the very first night, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, letting him know without saying it. He gave me a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and started walking again. A little while later, as we passed a stretch of driftwood scattered along the beach, he brushed his hand against my arm. It was brief, maybe even accidental, but it lingered in a way that wasn't accidental at all. The warmth of his touch stayed there, seeping into my skin long after his hand had fallen away. I didn't react, didn't want to risk breaking whatever fragile thing was unfolding between us. When we reached the end of the path, we stood there for a while, watching the tide roll in. He talked about a place overseas where the sunsets were so red they made the sky look like it was on fire, and I realized he wasn't just telling me about a view, he was letting me into a memory that still lived inside him. The walk back to town was quieter, though not uncomfortably so. Every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me, as if making sure I was still there. When we finally parted, he gave me a small nod and a "see you soon" that felt more like a promise than a casual goodbye. That night, lying in bed, I replayed everything, his voice, the way his eyes softened when he spoke about the things that haunted him, the brief touch on my arm. It was becoming harder to tell myself this was just a passing friendship or a harmless connection. Something deeper was taking root, and I could feel it pulling me toward him, even as a small, careful part of me whispered about the danger in wanting someone who couldn't be mine in the open. Still, as I drifted toward sleep, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I wanted more. And that want was already starting to feel like need. It was a cool afternoon when he asked me to come by his place. He made it sound casual, like it was nothing more than a favor. "Just need a hand with a project," he said over the phone, his voice steady but carrying a faint edge of something unspoken. I told myself not to read into it, but even as I walked the short distance to his house, I felt the same nervous energy I'd had that night at the community hall. His home was tucked away on a quiet street, set back from the road with a low stone wall and a garden that looked like it was cared for but not overly manicured. The front door opened before I even knocked, and there he was, wearing a faded t-shirt and dark jeans, his hair a little messy, looking less like the polished soldier everyone saw in public and more like a man who had just been living. He stepped aside to let me in, and as I crossed the threshold, I noticed how immaculate everything was. The space was beautiful in a way that made it feel almost unreal: soft, neutral colors, clean lines, furniture positioned with intention. Expensive pieces mixed with subtle personal touches, but there was a certain emptiness to it too. It was the kind of place you could photograph for a magazine, but it didn't have the lived-in warmth you'd expect from a home. We started on the so-called project, which turned out to be assembling a few shelves for his study. The work was simple, but it gave us something to focus on while we talked. He told me about a book collection he'd been building since his teens, and I caught glimpses of the titles stacked neatly on the floor: military history, poetry, old travel journals. Every so often, our hands would brush as we reached for the same tool, and though neither of us mentioned it, I felt each one. After the shelves were up, he offered me a drink, and we moved into the living room. It was just as carefully put together as the rest of the house: plush sofa, low coffee table, art on the walls that seemed to hold some private meaning for him. We sat across from each other, and he began telling me a story about a moment during his service that had changed him. His voice dropped slightly as he described being caught in a situation where seconds felt like hours, where every decision carried the weight of life or death. He didn't embellish it, he didn't need to. The way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes shifted to some invisible point beyond the room, told me how much it had stayed with him. I listened, not because I felt obligated but because it felt like an honor to be trusted with something so raw. There was a stillness in the air after he finished, a quiet that was neither awkward nor empty. He leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that felt unguarded, as if he was looking for something in my face: confirmation, understanding, maybe even a sense of safety. For a few moments, neither of us moved. The late afternoon light spilled through the window, stretching across the floor toward him, and I became aware of how close we were without actually touching. My heart was pounding, though outwardly I kept still, afraid to shatter whatever was building in the silence. Eventually, he shifted forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice low. "You ever think about how one moment can change everything?" I knew exactly what he meant, though my answer stayed locked in my chest. He didn't push. Instead, he stood, walked me to the door, and when we said goodbye, his hand lingered just a fraction longer on my shoulder than it needed to. There was no dramatic scene, no sudden crossing of lines, but the weight of that moment felt heavier than anything we had said all afternoon. As I walked back to my place, the cool air biting at my skin, I realized that his house, for all its beauty, was a reflection of him, carefully arranged, perfectly presentable, but hiding spaces that most people never got to see. And now, I had seen just enough to know I wanted to see more. That thought stayed with me the rest of the night, growing quieter but deeper, like a tide moving in beneath the surface. What began as chance encounters and carefully measured conversations turned into something neither of us could name but both of us knew existed. It wasn't planned. There was never a moment where we agreed to cross the line from casual friendship into whatever it had become, but it happened anyway. We started meeting more often, always under the veil of privacy. Sometimes it was dinner at a quiet spot on the edge of town where the lights were low and no one paid us much attention. Sometimes it was a long drive along the coast, windows down, music playing softly, the road stretched out ahead like an escape route neither of us would ever take. Other times, it was his living room, the fire casting shadows on the walls while we sat close enough for our knees to touch without either of us moving away. He led me into the parts of his life that didn't make it into the stories he told in public. The late-night whiskey on the back porch when sleep wouldn't come. The notebooks filled with half-finished thoughts, some dark and some tender, that he kept tucked away in a drawer. The photos from years ago, before the uniform and the medals, showing a younger version of him with a lighter smile. He spoke about things he'd never told anyone, not even the people who trusted him with their lives in the field. In those moments, the polished, untouchable soldier everyone admired faded, and I was with a man who could laugh at himself, admit his fears, and sit in silence without feeling the need to fill it. I told myself I should be careful, that this intimacy was dangerous, but I couldn't pull away. And the more I saw him like this, the more I realized how much of him the world would never know. Still, there was always the unspoken rule that what we had stayed in the shadows. In public, he played his role perfectly. If we passed on the street, he'd nod politely, as if we were acquaintances and nothing more. In private, he would sit so close his shoulder brushed mine, or lean in when he laughed like the sound was only for me. I thought I could live with it, being the secret, because the moments we had felt worth the risk. But I was wrong about how easy it would be. One night, after a late dinner at his place, we decided to drive down to the waterfront. The streets were quiet, and the shops were dark, their windows reflecting the glow of the street lamps. We parked near the pier and walked side by side, the air cool and heavy with the scent of the sea. He reached for my hand without looking at me, holding it just long enough for my chest to tighten, before letting it fall away as a car approached. That small shift, that quiet caution, reminded me of the fragility of what we were doing. We lingered near the edge of the pier, talking about nothing important, when a voice called his name from behind us. A man from town, someone I recognized but didn't know well, was heading toward us. In that split second, I felt the tension radiate from Ethan. He straightened, his expression smoothing into the practiced ease he wore so well. Introductions were quick, polite, and as soon as the man left, Ethan let out a slow breath. "Close one," he said, forcing a smile. I wanted to ask him what exactly would have happened if it hadn't been a close one, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. That moment stayed with me for days, not because of the near miss itself, but because of how much it seemed to matter to him. It was a reminder of the invisible line we were constantly walking, a line that could vanish beneath our feet without warning. And yet, neither of us stopped. If anything, the risk seemed to make our time together sharper, more alive. We began finding new ways to disappear into each other's company, hours spent listening to records at his place, talking until the sun began to rise, or driving out past the edge of town to sit in the dark and watch the stars. It was as if we both knew this couldn't last forever, so we were determined to burn through it while we could. I didn't know what that meant for me in the long run, or how I would feel when it ended. All I knew was that every time I left him, I carried the scent of his skin, the sound of his voice, and the weight of his presence like a secret stitched into me. And each time my phone lit up with his name, I answered, no matter the hour, no matter what it cost me to keep this going. It was late autumn when things began to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. The air had grown sharper, nights colder, and the leaves along the streets were turning brittle shades of gold and rust. We were spending more time together than ever, but something in him had changed. At first, it was subtle, moments where his eyes would drift, like his thoughts were miles away. Lately, his smiles didn't reach as far as they used to. One evening, he invited me over, saying he'd cooked something special. When I arrived, the house was warm and smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic, but his energy was different, quieter, more deliberate. We sat at the table, sharing a bottle of wine, and for a while it felt almost normal. But then, in the middle of a story, he stopped speaking, just watching me as if he was trying to memorize my face. The silence stretched, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. When I asked if something was wrong, he shook his head, but I could tell that wasn't the truth. After dinner, we moved to the couch. The fire flickered in the corner, casting an amber glow on his skin. He leaned back, running a hand over his jaw, and said softly, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." My chest tightened, but I didn't say anything, letting him find the words. He talked about his career, about obligations and appearances, about the way the military had given him everything and yet built walls around his life. There was no easy way for someone like him to live freely, not without consequences that would follow him everywhere. He didn't say the word us, but I felt it hanging between us. I wanted to tell him that I didn't care, that I'd take whatever pieces of him I could get, but part of me knew that wasn't fair, to him or to me. The night stretched on, and eventually we found ourselves sitting closer, our knees touching, his hand resting lightly on mine. It was a small gesture, but the weight of it was immense, like he was grounding himself in that contact. I could feel the conflict in him, wanting to hold on, afraid to let go. We didn't speak much after that. Instead, we sat in the glow of the fire, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the occasional crackle of wood. Every so often, he'd glance at me, his gaze lingering like there was more he wanted to say but couldn't bring himself to. When I finally stood to leave, he walked me to the door. It was colder outside now, the air biting at my cheeks. He stepped out with me, hands in his pockets, and for a moment we just stood there under the dim porch light. Then, without warning, he reached out, cupped my face in both hands, and kissed me, slow at first, then deeper, with a kind of urgency I hadn't felt from him before. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine and whispered, "I don't know how to make this work." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely speak. All I could say was, "We'll figure it out." But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. Walking home that night, I replayed the moment over and over, the taste of him, the warmth of his hands, the tremor in his voice. I knew this wasn't just about desire anymore. This was about something bigger, something neither of us had been prepared for when this began. And that terrified me as much as it thrilled me. Because deep down, I knew the more I loved him, the harder it would be when the world inevitably demanded we stop. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope in the dark, each step a careful balance between wanting him and fearing what wanting him could cost. We still saw each other, still found excuses to be in the same room, still carved out little pockets of time that belonged only to us. But there was an unspoken heaviness now, as if every laugh and every touch carried the weight of a clock ticking down. I noticed the way he checked his phone more often, how he sometimes stared at the window like he was watching for something that never came. There were moments when I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, half longing, half regret. One rainy afternoon, he called and asked if I could come over. His voice was low, almost hesitant, but I didn't question it. When I arrived, the sky was a dull gray and rain was streaming down the windows in restless streaks. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him, wearing a sweater I'd seen him in a dozen times before. He didn't get up when I walked in, just gave me a small smile and gestured for me to sit. For a long time, we didn't speak. I could hear the rain tapping on the roof, the distant sound of a car passing by, the slow ticking of the wall clock. Finally, he said, "I've been thinking about us." My stomach nodded instantly, but I forced myself to stay calm. He went on to talk about the pressure he was under, about the people who looked up to him, about the fear of rumors and what they could do to his career. It wasn't anything I hadn't heard before, but this time his tone was different. He sounded tired, worn in a way I hadn't seen before. I told him I understood, because part of me really did. I knew his life wasn't simple. I knew that loving him came with shadows that didn't exist for other people. But saying I understood didn't make it easier. It didn't make it hurt less to think of a future where I wasn't allowed to be a part of his world openly. He reached across the table and took my hand, holding it like it was something fragile he was afraid to break. His thumb brushed over my skin, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. "But I don't know how to keep you without risking everything." His words cut into me because they weren't a rejection, they were the truth, raw and unvarnished. I could feel the fight in him, the pull between what he wanted and what he thought he had to do. And in that moment, I realized I was caught in the same fight. We spent the rest of the afternoon in a strange limbo. We made tea. We sat by the fire. At one point, he pulled me into his arms and just held me, his chin resting on top of my head, breathing me in like he was afraid I might disappear. There was no urgency in it, no rush towards something physical, just the quiet desperation of two people trying to memorize the feeling of being together in case it had to end. When the rain finally stopped, the sun was already slipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the room. I didn't want to leave, but the heaviness between us made it hard to stay. As I stood in the doorway, he kissed me again, slower than usual, like every second mattered. His lips lingered on mine, and when he pulled back, I saw the shine of unshed tears in his eyes. I walked away that evening knowing something had shifted, not in a way that could be undone, but in a way that meant the days ahead would either break us apart or bind us together for good. And for the first time since we met, I wasn't sure which one I feared more. The day it all came to a head was colder than it should have been for spring. The air carried a sharp bite, and the wind seemed to cut straight through my jacket as I walked toward his place. I hadn't planned on seeing him that day, but something in my chest told me I needed to. For weeks we had been balancing on the edge, our connection growing deeper even as the world around him pushed us toward silence. The last time we'd spoken, his words had been heavy with the kind of meaning you don't say out loud. I was afraid of what I might find when I knocked on his door, afraid it might be the end, afraid it might be the kind of beginning that would cost us both more than we were ready to pay. When he opened the door, he looked different. Not in the way clothes or hair could change a person, but in the way his eyes seemed darker, as if the weight he'd been carrying had finally settled into him. He didn't say much, just stepped aside and let me in. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater, and I could smell coffee brewing somewhere in the background. We sat down in the living room, not touching at first, just looking at each other like we were both trying to figure out where to start. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "They know." I didn't need to ask who they were. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his shoulders squared like he was bracing for impact. Someone in his world, someone with enough power to make it dangerous, had found out about us. He explained it piece by piece, his words clipped but deliberate. A rumor had started, passed quietly from one mouth to another, and now it had reached the ears of people who wouldn't understand. People who would see his love for me not as something human and real, but as a threat to everything he had built. My chest felt tight as I listened, torn between the instinct to tell him we could survive it and the knowledge that surviving would come with scars. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me for a long time before answering. "I don't want to let go," he said. "But if I hold on, I could lose everything." The silence that followed was unbearable. My mind flashed through every moment we'd shared, the late-night talks, the quiet mornings, the laughter that felt like it belonged to another world. I thought about how easily love can be made invisible when the world decides it's not the right kind. He reached for my hand then, his grip warm and steady, and for a moment it felt like we were back at the beginning, before fear and duty started pulling us apart. "If you want to walk away," he said softly, "I'll understand." The words hit me harder than I expected. I knew he meant them, knew he was trying to give me an out before the storm hit, but all I could feel was the ache of what it would mean to leave. My voice shook when I told him, "I'm not walking away. Not now. Not like this." I could see the relief in his eyes, but also the worry that came with it. We both knew this wasn't the end of the fight, it was the start of a harder one. That night, we didn't talk about the future. We didn't make promises or try to plan our way around what was coming. We just stayed close, his arm around me, my head against his chest, listening to the slow rhythm of his heartbeat. It was the sound of a man who had been through battles and still had more to face, and the sound of the man I loved, even if the world never let me say it out loud. When I left in the early hours of the morning, the air was still cold, the streets empty, and a thin mist clung to the ground. I walked home knowing nothing had been solved, but everything had been decided. Whatever came next, we were going to meet it together, even if together was the most dangerous place for us to be. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who believes in love against all odds. Subscribe for more emotional and romantic LGBTQ stories that will stay with you long after they end. Your support helps us bring more voices, more truths, and more unforgettable love stories to life.